sheet went missing and I don't need to find it, so we're going to see if this is going to work. Oh, so many people. I'm Deb, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the South Dakota Humanities Council, the home of the South Dakota Center for the Book, and the Rapid City Public Libraries. I'm pleased to welcome you to this One Book South Dakota Author Tour event featuring Kathleen Norris. Kathleen's the award-winning author of New York Times bookseller The Cloister Walk, Amazing Grace, The Virgin of Bennington, as well as Dakota, A Spiritual Geography. And that's the 2014 One Book North Dakota and South Dakota book. And this is the first time that that's happened. She's also published 7 books of poetry, beginning with Falling Off, winner of the Big Table Younger Poets Award in '71. Soon after that, she settled in her grandparents' home in Lemon, South Dakota, where she lived with her husband, the poet David Dwyer, for more than 25 years. The move inspired Dakota and led to her involvement with the Lemon Presbyterian Church, then to her association as an oblate with Assumption Abbey in Richardson, North Dakota. Widowed in 2003, Kathleen Norris now lives in Hawaii and travels to the mainland regularly to lecture and teach. She's also the poetry editor for Spirituality and Health and the nonfiction editor of the St. Catherine Review. The North and South Dakota Humanities Council chose Dakota as their first ever joint One Book in commemoration of both states' 125th anniversary of statehood, which occurred November 2nd, 1889. Norris's unique perspectives on the history, culture, landscape, and spirit of the Dakotas have sparked reflection and discussion in communities across both states. And I believe that this is the first stop in South Dakota in the book tour. Please welcome Kathleen Norris.
Thank you. I'm a little overwhelmed. This is really wonderful. It's wonderful to be back in Rapid City. I'm very grateful to the Humanities Council, to the Public Library, and it just kind of confirms one of the positive things I think about people in the Dakotas, that you just don't follow trends, because to honor a book that is like 21 years old is really weird and countercultural and all of that. I mean, a book is supposed to go out of print after about 2 years so they can make room for the next celebrity memoir or something, and this is just a sign that we're on the right track, I think. And I have to tell you, I came down, I just spent last week going all over North Dakota, and I am in such a good mood because we came down from Dickinson down to Buffalo, and then I was handed over the prisoner exchange between the states, and handed over in Buffalo. I had lunch in Buffalo, and then I drove through Hardin County, and I don't think I've ever seen it so green. And I was glad to find out that that still really makes me excited, that that's a great thing. And I kept looking at all that clover thinking, oh boy, those guys are going to get a really great hay crop, and they deserve what they have it coming. So it just put me in such a good mood to not only the Humanities Council arranging for this, but God arranging all this good weather and green grass. It just was a wonderful day yesterday. What I did for this event, I kind of wrote a little talk, and I'll read some things from the book, and I definitely want to leave a lot of time for discussion. I have the feeling a few of you, especially the writers from the Prairie Winds gang, will have some comments and questions, and it should be interesting. But I want to talk a little bit. I decided to write kind of a new talk. One woman in North Dakota said it was kind of like getting a new chapter of Dakota, which that hadn't been on my mind. But basically to talk about my roots in the Dakotas, and also a little bit about how the book came to be and why I started to write it. As you heard, I lived about 25 years, from 1974 through 99 in the house. Oh, and one other thing, it really makes me nervous to have people standing, and I think the library has found every chair. And what I'd like to do is, if somebody, either now or even during my talk, interrupt me. I'm on a condo board, I'm used to getting called an idiot and worse and interrupted, and it won't bother me at all. If you really can't stand anymore, let me know, raise your hand, say something, and I'm sure someone would give up their seat. So I'd like to just do that now, because I hate to have people, having to stand. They're getting a suntan over there in the window, but they probably feel pretty warm, but okay. So anyway, my grandparents had built this house in the 1920s, It's still there. I still go there once a year, but my roots in this region go way back into the 19th century to Dakota Territory. One of my ancestors on my mother's side, my maternal grandfather's side, was a driver on the Deadwood to Bismarck stage. And there's a weird symmetry to this because, here I had ancestors living in Dakota Territory, and when I was a kid in 1959, my family moved to the territory of Hawaii. And then later that year, it did become an American state, where Obama really was born. And we won't go there. Except I had 2 nieces and a nephew born in the same hospital with the same kind of birth certificates, and I'll be happy to take anyone on. But in that first decade of the 20th century, the Milwaukee Road line was being built across northwestern South Dakota, and it left towns like McLaughlin, Walker, Watauga, Morristown, Thunderhawk, and Lemon in its wake, and many more, of course, that are no longer there. My mother could always name the ones that were in between that had pretty much disappeared. But my mother's parents came separately up to the then up-and-coming town of Morristown. My grandmother, Charlotte Totten, was a school teacher from Sioux City, Iowa. My grandfather had grown up in a very small town in northeastern Kansas called Beatty, and he had just gotten his medical degree in St. Joseph, Missouri. And I think they were typical of newcomers to the region, young people seeking adventure in what was then considered the frontier. But when they wanted to get married, her parents, who ran a grain mill in Sioux City, objected. They were very doubtful about her marrying someone that she'd met, even a doctor, someone that she'd met in so uncivilized a place. So they eloped in 1909. For a time they lived above a store on Morristown's Main Street, but after the town suffered several major fires, they moved to Lemon. That's where they spent the rest of their lives. And my grandfather practiced medicine there for 55 years. It wouldn't surprise me in the least to find out there's a Dr. Totten baby, someone who delivered in this room. My mother was born in Lemon in 1917, and she once commented that when she was growing up there, everyone was from someplace else. People could trace their ancestry to Norway, Sweden, Germany, Russia, the eastern United States. But it was much different when David and I came there in '74. The families who had been there for several generations sometimes talks about, my family's always been here, which that's a long time, and that always struck me as a little strange. And it became difficult when the farm crisis hit because the families who had been there maybe 4 generations were kind of hostile to the ones who'd been there only 2. Those kinds of crazy things happening. But then most of the young people from any of these families, once they left high school, they left the town. They left for college, they left for jobs elsewhere because there were no jobs available in the Lemon area. My father's history here in South Dakota is a little different. He moved here in South Dakota with his family in 1920 when he was 3 years old. He'd been born in Wallace, West Virginia, where his father was a Methodist pastor. And the Norris family came west for several reasons. One was that lure of opportunity that was drawing so many people out here to what was considered the open spaces of the West. And in such a place, it was felt that you could get a fresh start. And my grandfather was in need of that. He had served several churches after graduating from West. He'd worked his way through West Virginia Wesleyan, but there was some scandal attached to his name. His first wife, he married very young, and his first wife had abandoned him and their 2 small children. And then a few years later, after he met my grandmother, he had to get divorced in order to remarry and start another family. My father was the first child born in that family. And of course, many people didn't like the idea of a pastor who was divorced, no matter what the circumstances. And this was the reason that was actually given for him being fired from his last West Virginia church. One night when he was singing hymns with the youth group, he was a good musician, he played the banjo. And for years, it's only recently I began to understand that part of the reason for that the banjo was an instrument that had come over with the slaves. It was an African instrument, so that was part of it and the other scandals. So they moved to DeSmet in 1920. And then because in those days, the Methodist Church moved pastors every 2 years. And now this, by the time the family was out here for a while, it's 6 children, 2 from the previous marriage, 4 from the second one. My dad grew up in DeSmet, Cologne, Salem, Mitchell, Kimball, Groton, Faith, Hot Springs, and he finally graduated from high school in Murdo in 1935. His father went on to serve in other towns here and helped to build a Methodist church in Webster, raising money for the project and also using his old carpentry skills. Years ago, David and I had a wonderful visit with someone who remembered him and remembered, he showed us some of the things, I think the pulpit and some other things that my grandfather had built there. I have family in the Webster Cemetery, the Norris grandparents, their daughter, my Aunt Mary, and my parents' first child, an infant who died soon after birth when they were living in Renfield and teaching in the high school there. My father's favorite boyhood town was Hot Springs. He joined the Boy Scouts there and enjoyed camping in the Black Hills. He also received his first pay as a musician, which became his lifelong career. Hot Springs had a veterans home. I'm not sure if it does still. But anyway, his parents were musical. They wanted some training, so his mother tried to teach him the piano, but you know, mothers and sons rebellion and that. So they got my dad took bugle lessons from a veteran of the Spanish-American War. And then he got good enough to play for the funerals of Civil War veterans, earning the grand sum of 10 cents a funeral. That was enough to convince him that music was a good career. Well, 10 cents in the 20s, I guess, was a big deal. So those are my Dakota roots. My parents left South Dakota for college in the mid-30s. Dad started out at Morningside, but then they met at Northwestern in Chicago. And except for a few years there teaching in Redfield, like so many people in their generation, they never really returned. My parents, I think they were typical of that generation in also that they remained close to their parents. That's why I ended up spending pretty much all my childhood summers, at least till we moved to Hawaii, in Lemon, South Dakota. I read half the books in the Lemon Library, I think. And I learned to swim at the old WPA pool on the west side of town. Any kid from Lemon would remember that. It's gone now, but that pool was on the windiest, chilliest spot on a hill on the northwest side of town. And my mom, when I would be gone too long in the afternoon at the pool, my mom and with my grandmother as the enforcer would come up there, and if my lips were blue, I had to get out of the water. So the Dakotas are a really big part of my life story, but they're only a part of it, and my geography is kind of wild. After I finished high school in Honolulu, I went to college in Vermont and then to a job in New York City, and that's where I met my husband, David, who was also an aspiring writer. And back in 1973, when both my grandparents died, the normal thing for my mom to do would be sell the house in town and also sell this ranch property that her dad had owned for years in Morristown. But she really didn't want to do that. She had a very strong attachment here. And then I decided that my job in arts administration, which I really loved, it was kind of at a dead end. And so I suggested, much to my parents' surprise, and I had to kind of talk my husband into it. He was born and raised in the suburbs of New York, and if you watch Mad Men, my husband was commuting on the train with all the Mad Men in the 60s, 50s and 60s. He commuted into high school. He got a scholarship to a Jesuit school in Manhattan. So he was a New Yorker. But my parents were surprised. My husband, I guess it must have been madly in love because he agreed to come. And I just said, well, let us go out there until you decide what you want to do. Well, she didn't really have to decide because David and I settled in, and 25 years later, we had to leave. And I think that's, when I see the abandoned houses out here in the country, I always wonder what events happened to make that, sometimes people were building a better house, but often it was, some circumstances changed and you had to leave, and that's kind of what happened to us. When we left in December of 1999, our original plan had been to go up to Bismarck, fly out of Bismarck, and do what we usually did at Christmas, was stay with my family in Honolulu and have a nice family Christmas. But we literally left in the middle of the night for the emergency room at St. A's Hospital. And my husband never, we were planning to return, he wanted to return. He never made it back, but I would come back every year, and David would give me a list of books and things that he wanted from the house. So every time I'd come, I'd bring an empty suitcase and fill it and go back out there. It was just health reasons. We had to spend a month at St. A's in the hospital and then rehab. He had only one lung by then and had a blood clot on it, and it's a miracle that he lived through that. He had about 18 lives and he used up every one of them. And then also the other thing was that, you know, in Lemon you've got good doctors, but you're 130 miles from the nearest big hospital. In Honolulu it's a 5-minute ambulance ride. And then what David realized very quickly is if you only have one lung, it's a lot easier to breathe at sea level at 2,500 feet, which is Lemon's altitude. And the humidity in the air helps. Also, my parents were then entering their 80s, and I thought I really wanted to be closer to them to help out as they aged. And that turned out to be the silver lining to this crazy thing. So, you know, I never expected to live in Hawaii again. It's never a place that has really felt much like home to me, but I don't expect any sympathy, especially in January. Because in January I may have to take a rain poncho, but I can walk bare-legged and I can go swimming out of doors, and I go, ha, take that, South Dakota. My husband and I had both published some poetry when we came to Lemon. Anybody want a seat? I'm just wondering if anybody would like to exchange a seat at this point. Tough people. South Dakota. My husband and I were both published, and we kind of thought this place would be good for our writing. David settled very happily in. He worked his way through college as a bartender, and he settled in as a bartender. And I started working at the local public library. And between the two of us, I think we heard all the gossip from all the angles. The men gossiping, the women gossiping, we kind of heard it all, which of course for a writer is wonderful. And I was really glad that David appreciated the stark beauty of the place. One of the comments he made after we visited a French ranch south of town is that, you know, people say there's nothing out here. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in any field out here, any pasture. There's a lot going on. And he settled in so well, in fact, that he served 2 terms on the city council in Lemon. And a number of people were trying hard to convince him to run for mayor. And one of the upshots of him being on the city council is that Lemon probably has the best written sewer ordinance for miles around. David helped to write it. They had a big sewer project up there. And some of our friends back east would say, "What are you doing up there?" And he would quote one of his favorite poets was William Butler Yeats. And when someone asked Yeats why he was running and served in the Irish Parliament, he said, "It's all grist for the mill." But of course, when we moved to South Dakota in '74, the farm economy was booming. Wheat prices were way up, cattle prices, land prices, everything was really, really booming. And then about 10 years later, that was all gone. It's really crashed very fast, what was termed the farm crisis. And, you know, the sense of pain, the sense of loss, you just felt it in the air. Ranchers who had hoped to retire now having to struggle to save their land, the land that they had intended to leave to their children. And then more successful operators buying up places that had been homesteaded by their neighbors' grandparents. And one thing I think about this place a lot, it was a young man had married and settled on a little place south of Lemon with a toddler and an infant, and his wife, and no running water except a pump in the basement. This would have been the late '70s, pump in the basement, hauling water upstairs, you know, this kind of thing. They were willing to put up with that because he was so excited about being back on the homestead place. And they had a great 5-seater outhouse with a and it was always an adventure to go to the bathroom there because usually you get a parade of animals and small children following them out there. But, you know, a few years later, that place had to be sold. And now on that road, that one particular gravel road, there were 5 ranches there when we moved there in '74, and there's one today. And I think that story is a familiar one all through the Dakotas. And I was witnessing all of this, and I came at the farm crisis kind of from another angle because by then I'd been looking at small towns, their institutions, schools, and churches. I'd begun taking some free classes offered by the Lutherans for clergy continuing education. And I was meeting pastors from a wide variety of denominations out there, but they all had a similar story. that their congregations were in great turmoil. There was a lot of intergenerational conflict, what one pastor termed young fogies in their 30s who were really resisting change and fighting over matters, large and small, with the older generation. People were behaving, and then also often they were really scapegoating pastors, because I think that's one thing I learned sort of in human psychology. If you've got a really big problem like the farm crisis, it's much easier to focus on an individual like this pastor from outside who came here. Let's all hate him together. And it's not going to solve any problems, I guess, but that's kind of what people tend to do. So people were behaving really badly. And of course, if you're a writer, you have mixed feelings about that, because it's really interesting. And you say, gee, I would like to write about this. But at the same time, I mean, these people are your friends, and you can see the pain it's causing. So it was a tough time. But people were holding secret meetings and sending pastors anonymous hate mail. One pastor's wife told me that she realized it was the beginning of the end for them the day they moved in. And this, I remember, this is a story I will never forget. I don't think it made it into the Dakota, but it's one of those that I just will never forget. Parishioners had come to help them unpack, as they would in a small town. That would be expected, a number of people. But they cooled noticeably when they saw that the furniture and drapes were good quality, much better than they expected a pastor to have. And this wasn't new furniture, it was fairly old in fact, but it was very high quality. 2 years later, this was registered as an actual complaint at a church council meeting. So that was the kind of insanity. And again, as a writer, I'm like, wow, this is great. This is great. The other perspective on all of this that kind of came into the book, I was traveling all over North Dakota and some in South Dakota for the arts councils, going into schools and working with students on writing, and sometimes teachers also writing poetry. In South Dakota, I was in Mobridge, Chamberlain, Pier, and Britain. There's some others I may have even forgotten. And of course, Prairie Winds every year in the Black Hills, the writing workshop. And anybody can tell you about my husband and I both went and did that, and teaching and giving readings and trying to encourage young people. And of course, David was always a big hit because he could recite Jabberwocky from memory in English, French, and German. You really haven't lived until you've heard Jabberwocky in German. And in some of the towns, if they were small enough that they didn't really have a motel, and so I stayed with families. And so all of this gave me a really broad perspective on what was happening out here with the economy in small towns. And I could see all the serious upheaval happening here. And apart from a few articles I found in places like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, no one seemed to be paying attention. And I realized as a writer I couldn't ignore it. I also realized that the story was much too big for what I had been writing and publishing, which was small lyric poems. So I started to write prose. That was a discovery in itself. Someone once said, publish a book of poems and wait for the response. It's like dropping a feather in the Grand Canyon and listening for the echo. Well, prose can get a response, and the real trigger for Dakota came for me when I was reading the North Dakota Quarterly. It's out of the UND, and the late Bob Lewis, his wonderful editor. He was looking for papers on towns, myths that help small towns survive. And I thought about that for a while, and I wrote him. And of course, in those days, you could actually put a letter in the mail with a stamp on it, and send. That was the only way to get him, I guess. I wrote him, and I said, I would like to write about the myths that help small towns self-destruct, because that's what I'm seeing around me. And he said, go for it. So I wrote this thing called Gatsby on the Plains, and that became the first chapter of the book. And one of the myths that I was hearing, and it really troubled me, well, this is a wonderful place to raise our family because this is a place where nothing ever changes. And this was the young fogies speaking. This was a woman in her 30s, and we need to get back to how it was 20 years ago. She could sense there was change, but she also wanted to believe that it wasn't really happening. And like Lemon is a town, it was 2,800 people in 1950. It was about 2,400 when we moved there. It's 1,200 today. the last census. And so that's major change. And I think if you're not prepared to even admit the extent of the change that's happening, you're much less able to cope with it, except in a kind of a negative way. And that's kind of what I was seeing. And I wrote this letter, and I wrote this thing, and I sent it to a Lutheran pastor I knew, a man who'd been born and raised in the West River of North Dakota, and had served churches there for years. He was a Lutheran pastor in the little town of Reeder. And I sent him this draft of this essay, and I said, what do you think? And about a couple days later, I got a 6-page single-spaced letter telling me what he thought, and it was wonderful. It was, I know what you're saying. I don't want to agree with it. I hate you for saying it, but you're right about a lot of things. And then when North Dakota Quarterly published my essay, I insisted that we print his letter along with it. Keith edited it a little bit, you know. I had to get permission from him to do that, but both the article and the response appeared in the issue, and that made me feel happy because then people could sort of, you know, see what they thought about it. But here's something that Keith wrote me in that letter. We need outsiders here, but often end up repelling them, especially professionals, especially ministers. I've heard glowing praise turn into bitter fire within a few years. Prairie people know they do this, and hidden in their rejection is a seed by which they set themselves up to be exploited and then abandoned over and over again. And I could sort of see that happening around me. And that article just kept on generating interest, and the responses were either very negative or very positive. So I knew I'd hit a nerve. And of course, as a writer, that felt good. It felt like I was onto something. The range of response continued once the whole book was published. Ruth Myers, who was then the lieutenant governor of North Dakota, wrote an editorial for the Bismarck Tribune, and she basically said I'd hit the nail on the head. Other papers, and also myself, I got letters saying, how dare you write about this place, and if I don't like it here, I should just leave. And I suspect that the book will always generate that kind of response from people out here. Pastors were telling me they were discussing that essay, the Plains essay, in their churches, and they were getting exactly the same thing. Some people hate this, some people love it. I want to say something about how the book took shape. At first, I was concentrating on the social and political aspect, the farm crisis. There was a big controversy about whether we should just dump nuclear waste in the Black Hills, which kind of tells you how the rest of the country views this place. I mean, and all of these things. The Dakota pickup truck came out, all these ads, you know, while the farm crisis was being ignored. I mean, it was this weird thing. Dances with Wolves, another thing where, you know, it's safe to look at the past. We don't really care what people are doing out there now. It was that kind of weird thing. So I wrote about that, but gradually I really wanted to paint a more complete picture, partly for myself. The weather, the landscape in all seasons, the people, small towns and churches. And when I write a book, I'm always using outside readers to help me. When I wrote The Cloister Walk about Benedictine monasteries, I asked a Benedictine monk and also a sister to read it and catch mistakes. And in the case of Dakota, it was two farmers, or ranchers, I mean, from Hope Church, that I knew would be helpful. And one of the things they pointed out was I had called a pasture a field. I knew better, but it had slipped by me, as it would not slip by a rancher. A pasture is a pasture, and a field is a field, and you better know the difference. And so all sorts of little things like that really helped. But the big thing came when the late Tom Lyman, who was one of my mom's high school classmates, he talked to me and wrote a letter too. He said he thought the book was just too negative. It was focusing too much on the negative stuff. And he knew I loved living out there, knew I loved the place, so he needed more of that. And that actually led me to write the chapter on Hope Church. And I said, he's right, he's absolutely right. Let me think about some things I want to say about what I love here. I did that, and of course the funniest thing there was that my editor for Dakota, this is one of the miracles of my life, because she really understood what I was writing. She didn't suggest crazy things like city people might. She's born and raised in Manhattan, but somehow she got it. And she agreed with Tom Lyman, and I said, and she's no slouch as an editor. She edited the Kite Runner. I mean, she's really a marvelous editor. And I said, you know, you're taking editorial advice from a rancher in the West River. And she said, that's just fine, he's right. So we made literary history, I guess, on that one. But that's kind of, that's really where the book came from, why I started to write it, and what I wanted to kind of end up with. And the other thing, when David and I would go back and visit family and friends in New York, we were amazed because everybody wanted to hear about this exotic place that we were living. To them, it was so strange, and only a few of them ever had the nerve to come out and visit. Some of them, the open sky drove them nuts, some of them loved it. You never knew, you always warned them, there's a lot of sky between here and Bismarck Airport and Lemon. A lot of land, a lot of cows, and not many people. But so I started trying to paint a picture, and the whole book, I think, in a sense, is the work of a frustrated painter. So here's how I want, and I knew I had to do it quickly to invite people into the book. So here's how the book begins, and I'm just going to read two little sections here, and I'm going to read one of my husband's poems for sure. I want to get to some conversation. But I found a quote from The Wizard of Oz that just I love. It's from the novel, the original novel. The Scarecrow sighed, "Of course, I cannot understand it," he said. "If your heads were stuffed with straw like mine, you would probably all live in the beautiful places, and Kansas would have no people at all. It is fortunate for Kansas that you have brains." Roll that around. The high plains, the beginning of the desert west, often act as a crucible for those who inhabit them. Like Jacob's angel, the region requires that you wrestle with it before it bestows a blessing. This can mean driving through a snowstorm on icy roads, wondering whether you'll have to pull over and spend the night in your car, only to emerge under tag ends of clouds into a clear sky blazing with stars. Or a vivid double rainbow marches to the east, following the wild summer storm that nearly blew you off the road. That was actually between here and Rapid, that one. The storm sky, between Rapid and Lemon. The storm sky is gunmetal gray, but to the west, the sky is peach, streaked with crimson. The land and sky of the west often fill what Thoreau termed our need to witness our limits transgressed. Nature in Dakota can indeed be an experience of the holy. I'm not going to read the section on Jell-O because you know all about Jell-O. there's some dividing line. I think it's in Ohio someplace where Jell-O becomes salad. Never quite, because it isn't salad on either coast, but there's some place in the middle where it turns into salad. But even that was an education for me because a friend of mine, they were on a ranch way south of Lemon, and they didn't get electricity until the late 1950s. And his mother was ashamed because to make Jell-O, it was easy to make Jell-O if you had refrigeration. And she'd want to bring a Jell-O dish to the Catholic Church in Lemon, but she couldn't. And he would describe how she would just try to get these ice cubes and all this stuff to get the Jell-O to set. To serve Jell-O was a big deal. And that was something, again, a perspective I never would have had, but there it was, that to make a big deal out of Jell-O like that. And I learned just learning. I was learning all along when I was writing this. I'm going to read this little chapter called Evidence of Failure because one of the things that my pastor friend Keith said to me, he finally left the Dakotas, where he lived all his life. He took a church in a city in Kansas, and he said, "This is the first time in my life I've been in a church in a city, a town that is growing and not dying." And I thought, yeah, because he spent all his life in the West River. That's the story. The homesteaders came out. Perkins County had like almost 11,000 people in 1910. All the homesteaders had come out. And now it's something like 3,000, maybe 4,000. It's that slow decline because people discover that you can't get by on 160 acres and a cow. It doesn't work here. And so I think there's evidence of failure all around us, and there's some stories in my family. I just decided to put together this kind of catalog. My grandmother Totten's rain barrel chipped on its side. She would draw water from it to rinse her hair. or fill a dented sprinkler can to water her houseplants and flower garden. I let water freeze in it and the bottom buckled. The lily of the valley in her flower bed that I never rescued from weeds whose names I don't even know. The piano gathering dust in my living room. Standing in the weeds around the auctioneer's truck, a bird's eye maple set, a vanity with oval mirror, a bed with a scrolled headboard, a dainty desk and straight-backed chair, some dry rot. Sold $100. 3 houses on a farm tucked into the fold of the Grand River breaks, a stone house, a log cabin, a 2-story frame with gabled roof, each built with care, each placed further above the flood stage, each built bigger to accommodate a growing family, abandoned now, a patchwork quilt still on the attic bed, a well-worn whetstone by the kitchen door. A Bible inscribed Dr. Mrs. Totten, its back broken, the binding glue dried out, the webbing on its spine exposed. Prayers clipped from newspapers tucked throughout its pages, the yellow paper crumbling. A handwritten prayer, keep me friendly to myself, keep me gentle in disappointment, has weathered badly in the long crescendo of Romans 8. And in the Psalms, a dried prairie rose, a photograph of a baby in a coffin. A brochure printed on cheap green paper announcing John Luther Norris Evangelist, a man whose heart is warm with the gospel. He tried to save Deadwood in 1924. We all can see how well that turned out. My grandfather was, there were a few years there where he was kind of a freelance evangelist, and that was a brochure that my dad had kept all those years. So I'm going to read 2 poems that are kind of a feel-good poems for me. One of them is, my husband liked big machines, so he hired, then we can have some conversation. He hired himself out to work on tractors and balers. He learned some of this stuff around farm work and enjoyed it. And this is a poem he wrote, but when you turn a poet loose with a tractor and baler, some strange things might happen. And so this is what happened. It's Baling Wheat Straw on My 33rd Birthday by David Dwyer. Between fallow and fallow, the mile-long strips of stubble 10 rods wide surrender each from 250 to 400 bales to the spring-steel fingers and closed-mouthed jaws of the loud, fast-talking machine. Stubble by stubble by stubble by fallow, it says, in the light straw on the hilltops, and she won't, going down the draws. My old 840 John Deere tractor asks me, but what do you know, she might. Riding the clutch in the thick bottom land, I lose all track of their talk, tractor and baler, both chattering, both snarling nonsense. A golden eagle helped me seed this field last spring and ate the mice and gophers I uncovered. Now a misguided seagull follows me, an easy symbol of exile and high hopes. Hopes, the tractor mutters, beginning to climb the draw. Hopes, slopes, ropes, learn the ropes. The baler answers, even the birds can fly. The dead, the tractor snaps, the dead, even the birds. They have begun to argue, it is so steep. Even the dead, now doesn't it, even the birds can fly. Even the dead, but doesn't it, even the dead can lie down. But doesn't it make you feel old? Well, you are. You are. David read that once in Lemon, some kind of event, and a farmer came up to him and said, I've got a tractor and baler, but they don't sound a thing like that. They're saying something, but it's not. And David said, well, you're just going to have to write your own poem. And the last thing I'll read, this is a story that I got from my mom, and it's just one of those things. We were out here driving around in one of her visits to the West River. I got her out here finally, she was 88. She was using a walker by then, but was otherwise pretty good. She ran and saw her old high school boyfriend and all the important things, like that. And it was wonderful. But this was earlier, and we were driving around, and she started to tell me this story about something my grandmother did in the 20s with a bunch of other women in town. And I'd never heard it before, and it just somehow stayed with me, and I had to write this little poem about it. And Elsa, as a woman, I actually remembered one of the only Jewish family in town. They had a dry goods store on Main Street, and she really was a picture bride. The picture would come over from Germany, and they would get engaged on the base of the picture. But pomme de terre. 3 women laugh aloud in a sun-dappled kitchen in 1927 in South Dakota. They are learning French to improve themselves. Twice a week they come together. Today they are naming vegetables. Haricot vert, one reads aloud, pointing to the beans. Green, says Elsa, the German picture bride, lamenting the forests she will never see again. Lottie and Myrtle recall a paradise of their own, gentle hills at Sioux City on down along the river. They laugh in the afternoon in a house set down on a godforsaken, near treeless plain. Each tree they planted in town either broke with ice or wilted in the rainless summer. Chou fleur, they say, for cauliflower. Potatoes are pommes de terre. The words have such a comforting sound that Lottie repeats them like a mother comforting a child. Oh, my little earth apples, little pommes de terre. My cabbage flowers, oh yes. And now the women's cheeks and breasts are blooming, their bottoms grow round in the chintz dresses. They are ladies, yes, pious and respectable, but they are laughing now, beyond caring. Such elegant potatoes. Pomme de terre, my dear. Oh, my dears, oh yes. So now we need to have a conversation, maybe even a riot. This is such a good crowd. Again, anybody really need a seat, because I'm sure there are people who would be willing to give up a seat at this point if anybody wants one. But questions, comments? Yes, Rita?
I also moved from Washington, D.C. to outside of the city about 3 years ago. And I'm wondering if a transition that's so radical from a city to a rural area, although I grew up also in a rural area, does that spark the creativity that leads to the changes in your writing? Or do you think creative people are more open to making those sort of radical transitions?
That's a good question. I mean, does a radical move like that kind of stimulate creativity, or is it just going to be there anyway? I think in my case, I knew I was moving back. In a sense, it was almost like a deliberate haunting. I knew I was moving back to the house where my mother was raised. Her toys were still there in the basement. A lot of my grandparents' things were there, and I thought, I'm not a poet if that's not going to do something to me. I certainly didn't anticipate writing a prose book. I mean, I was really writing only poetry when we first got there. And I did find the landscape very inspiring. The first poems I wrote are about driving down to that friend's place, it's called Whiteview Road, driving down to that place and helping them work cattle. I was in the kitchen where I was totally useless. My husband would have been very useful in the kitchen, but that was not even considered. He was a very good cook. But he was out with the cattle and stuff, and then everyone discovered to their delight that he was a good cook and knew what to do with Rocky Mountain oysters. So that was the day. But about creativity, I think and it's ironic because in Hawaii I've always felt the place is so beautiful it doesn't need me to write about it. There's this kind of an ironic thing. I come out here and the landscape is very inspiring and very beautiful. Everyone knows what Hawaii looks like, but nobody knows what this place looks like and why you might want to look at it closer. So I think there was that kind of going on. But I think any radical change is going to stir things up, whether you're moving from a small town to a city or a city to a ranch or something, a farm. It's going to stimulate something. And I think part of it is just the confidence that I can write about this. People need that. And some of the best responses I got from Dakota were people saying, I'm buying it for my mom because she has all these wonderful stories and she won't tell them because she doesn't think they're important. And so that's just, knowing I was a writer to begin with really helped because I at least had the confidence that even if nobody reads this poem, I want to write it, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got your book. I had to look around. I'm getting old enough to where it took me twice going around the shelves to find it. I read it years ago, and I want to tell you that you are a gift to South Dakota.
It's kind of funny to hear that because I'm pretty sure no one in Hawaii thinks of me that way. My old high school classmates, I run into them all the time. But thank you. I mean, there's a lot of writers sitting in this room who are also gifts. Linda, Dan O'Brien, Linda Hazelstrom, and probably other people. Eric is here.
You told the truth about us.
Yeah.
And that is not easy for South Dakotans sometimes to accept.
Yes, I learned that when I got over here.
But I want you to sign this before I leave.
Well, yeah, we're having a book signing for sure. But one of the great things that happened just in the last few years, South Dakota State asked if they could have my archives, and I said, you mean my mess? Kind of. But whenever I come to Lemon, I send them more stuff. But all of the letters that I received about Dakota are now at South Dakota State. Because I had saved them all because I got such a response from all over the world. I got a beautiful handwritten note from George McGovern. Remember the people with the Buffalo Commons? I got a really thoughtful letter from Deborah and Frank Popper. But that's all now at South Dakota State, and you can find it. You can look it up and see that. And I just, I was very grateful because that to me was really important. Those responses were important, and now they have a home, so I'm glad about that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if the social comment that you have in this area is repeated in other parts of the United States or even elsewhere. Have you heard comment from other people who read this?
Okay, yeah. Well, actually, one of the reasons that the book got published, my editor's boss, another editor at that publishing house said, you have described my small town in New Hampshire perfectly. And so I think that was one of the reasons they were willing to publish the book, because they felt like I had described something that a lot of people knew about small town life. And I got a letter from a university professor somewhere in New Jersey, I think. He said, you've described my English department perfectly. I got a letter from a missionary in Egypt that said, I had to come, I came from a lush environment to the desert, and reading what you're quoting these desert monks, actually from Egypt, from 1700 years before. She found that really meaningful for her. So I got a lot of response. But then I really was raising some weird questions. I mean, one title that, it's just the gravity that had me. Can you tell the truth in a small town? And of course, that's going to get people's backs up. But when you think about it, if you're in a small town and you need to keep living with these people, how do you tell the truth, or do you just let things slide and fester? And, that kind of thing. I thought that was a question worth asking. But, so I think small towns are everywhere, and they tend to be more similar than the others.
I'm from right south of Dickinson, North Dakota, in New England, North Dakota, and
I've been to New England. That's where some of those classes were held. I had lunch at the bowling alley, yes.
Anyway, I moved here 32 years ago, but I'm wondering, in terms of what you saw happening in North Dakota now, which is a total revolution and really a disruption of life, if that is engendering any thoughts or creativity leading towards something that would explain this?
Well, it was interesting, because I gave a reading in Minot, and I had to go on Highway 12 through Stanley and Ray. It's a very small town of Ray, where I once spent 2 weeks up there working in the schools, and then down, we did get through Williston and then down Highway 85. I was kind of prepared for it. The best articles that I had seen about it, again, came from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Christian Century sent someone out from Chicago to talk to pastors up there about how this was affecting all their churches. So I've been reading about it. I was aware of it. And again, I guess I love to say things that upset people. My dad was kind of the same way. When people in North Dakota are saying, oh, it's really terrible up there. And I said, it can't be that bad. I've seen northern New Jersey. And people who had seen northern New Jersey can, because, oil, the big oil, the big white oil tanks, truck traffic, all that kind of stuff. And actually, two things really struck me. Of course, the man camps, the trailer camps, some of which look really well organized, and some of them just look crazy. I don't know how anyone could stand to live there. It's pretty awful to see that and to realize that some of these towns quadrupled in a matter of months in terms of population. But 2 things struck me was how, at least looking at it from the road, there were still a lot of pretty good-looking farms and ranches up there, happy-looking cattle herds, and lots of crops in the field. So somehow, for a lot of that area, the farming and the ranching is coexisting pretty well with the oil people and the oil exploration. And then when I was in Minot and Watford City, which is right at the heart. Watford City is one of those places that has quadrupled in size, and it was really interesting to hear people there that they kept talking about how that all the media coverage is about the negative stuff, and of course there have been some crimes, horrendous crimes, stupid crimes, all kinds of stuff going on that never used to happen up there, and all the problems that you do get. Overburdened infrastructure, the police, having to figure out how to handle all these things. Of course, a lot of the man camps are big enough. They have their own police force, security forces and stuff. But they said that there are some positive things too, and that's what we are focusing on when we live here. And one of them said, now our young people don't go away. They stay and they have jobs. And I was talking to, who was I talking to? Someone here in Rapid City. Oh yeah. Got a grandson up there who's making good money and he's saving it, and he's got plans, and so, and apparently, from talking to her and some other people, there's a lot of young men, especially raised on farms and ranches out in the West River, who would probably be down in Denver or, somewhere looking for work, that found work up there. And so, a lot of it isn't people coming in from outside, it's local. Fairly local people from the Dakotas working up there. So it was interesting to me that they didn't want to whine. They wanted to talk about what how they were dealing with the, and working on things. And the ultimate thing in Watford City, their Humanities Council people are geniuses, total geniuses. They have a wonderful county history museum. It's absolutely fabulous. It's in a little building right near the highway. You can go in, and they've got displays downstairs, and some meeting rooms and things, but a wonderful museum upstairs. And part of the downstairs is it's actually a non-profit liquor store. So they're benefiting like crazy. And I was there Friday night, so we're having a program upstairs. And I said, we need a mic because it might get kind of loud down there. Where all these young men were coming in to buy their booze for the weekend, and they're making tons of money. And it's good. They don't have to do a lot of fundraising for the museum because it's going to be that museum. That's creative. That's really creative. And in fact, the people who run the liquor store also work at the museum. I mean, it's just, I just said that is genius. That is absolute genius. But yeah, it is. I mean, I actually worked in Williston. I worked in the rural school district in Williston, and also the city during the boom of the '80s, which people thought was pretty extreme. And then afterwards, I was up there afterwards too, and everything just fell apart. Lots of empty stores and restaurants and stuff. So it is a lot bigger. I mean, you can just tell. Stanley and Ray just blew my mind because those were tiny little towns, and Stanley and Ray looked like they had just so many oil facilities and so much action. And names like Halliburton and Schlumberger and these huge international companies up there. So it was weird. There's a hand. Eric.
I'm going to start by, the book came out in 1993. Your Netscape, in a sense, launched the internet. How do you think the internet has transformed our relationship to place?
How has the internet transformed our relationship to place? Boy, I hadn't thought about that a whole lot. I think if I were still living here, I would be writing about this place. It would be easier to do research on Google. I mean, because I've used computers because my husband was an amateur, along with being a poet, he was an amateur computer programmer and stuff like that. So we had computers since the 70s, some of the big apples, like the thing was as big as this podium. But I've always regarded it as nothing more than a tool. And so just instinctively, I used the internet for research. I went on Facebook just to keep up with my nieces and nephews and now grandnieces, get baby pictures. I mean, I don't really use it for a whole lot more. And if my publisher ever says you have to have a website or a blog, I might look for a new publisher. I mean, I use it and I admire it for what it can do, but I also kind of resist. And maybe that's just a writer's instinct. But I think, I think a lot of people are out writing. They're writing about place. They're blogging about place. I met a guy who, Taylor, what's his his last name Taylor, but he does a blog for Huffington Post, and he writes a lot about North Dakota. So people who read the Huffington Post might actually be better informed about North Dakota than they would be, you know, in the early 90s, before the net. So I think there's, again, positive and negative stuff. You'd have to pay me to play a video game. So, you know, but what, I'll be curious to maybe talk to you later about that, because you probably have another perspective on it. Yeah.
I'm just fixing to tell you, way back when, I was one of the people who left to get an education. It seemed like everybody went to Denver or everybody went somewhere else to become educated. And I became educated and I had this fancy job and I came back and I had brought a copy of Dakota. It was newly published and I wanted to share it with my grandmother. And I was bouncing into the house, so excited and so thrilled. My aunt was there. And my mom, he said, Grandma, look at this great book. And she says, oh, Doc Totten. He saved your mother's life.
Well, that's a wonderful Doc Totten story, and I have to tell the one that my husband told from the bar, because you know, probably none of his customers were Doc Totten babies, or the younger generation. The last thing that, you know, they would have their football physicals from him, and they didn't have such fond memories of him then. But one of the guy came in, a rancher that didn't come to the bar very often, and he had pretty gnarled hands, and he had a big scar on one hand, and he said, "See that? See that? You know, your grandpa." He thought it was his father-in-law, grandfather. You know, Doc Totten saved my life. That would have been, I probably would have had a hand amputated. You saved my life. Of course, you killed my younger brother. So. I think with doctors, you hear both sides of the story. That's a wonderful story. Oh, more? Okay, good.
So, as our family traveled and did everything that they were supposed to do growing up, my children, my grandchildren, and now my great-grandson, they came back to South Dakota to be educated. And so my daughter is an RN. She works at here. It's so good to be back home.
Good.
And so it's kind of like your question of what happened then and what happened now. It's full circle. And those of us who left,
Good.
for our children and our grandchildren to be educated.
I think, you know, just there is a kind of sanity in both Dakotas that you wonder about the rest of the country sometimes. In Southern California, we've known that for years, but there's a kind of sanity here. In fact, when my publisher asked me to write a preface to the book and talk about reactions, you know, to the book in Lemon and elsewhere and everything, I had a lot of fun writing that and telling a lot of stories. And I said, one of the things I love about here is like, you know, if I got a big head because I was making some money and went out and bought a Prada dress, anyone in Lemon found out how much I paid for it, I would never live it down. Because everyone knows it's stupid to pay that much money for a piece of clothing. I mean, that's the kind of sanity I mean, not following those kinds of trends. And so thank you. I hope, you know, I hope that that is happening. But I remember when I was on tour, you know, the publisher only published 8,500 books. That's all they thought they could sell. And by the time the hardback was out, there was over 200,000. And a lot of the reason for that was, and the reason it got national attention is because, certainly on the West Coast, all over the West Coast, you have a lot of people whose families left the Dakotas in the 20s and 30s during really hard times, the Dust Bowl and all of that. Or sometimes they left during World War II to get jobs in factories, munitions, you know, military stuff for the war effort. And so I remember I was reading once, giving a talk from the book at Elliott Bay Bookstore in Seattle, which is a great bookstore, and I just said, you know, I want to know how many people here have roots in the Dakotas, or somewhere on the Great Plains, Western Plains, that either you, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and it was almost half the audience. And so I think that's part of, then I finally understood that's part of the reason that the book did as well as it did, because there were all these people out there, well, my grandpa came from Dakota, I'd like to read about this place. It was that kind of thing. But it would be good, I mean, I think, you know, I've seen pastors too who have gotten really tired of serving churches in really huge cities, and they come out sometimes to small towns, sometimes to small cities, I'll say, like Rapid, and stuff. So I hope that's happening. Yeah.
I'm taking you off of this book just a little with this question. What is very interesting about your writings, you know, you've talked about the serendipity of what life is like, the surprises in a small town in South Dakota. But another surprising thing about your work is the way that you kind of wandered into the spiritual from the secular. And is there something about place that has that, you know, to thank for it? Or is it just a sign of the times? Maybe, you know, in larger and smaller places, people are wandering from the secular into the spiritual. Do you have a comment
Well,
on that?
and you know, that's real personal kind of for me, because I went to Lemon and I lived in New York City, which has pretty much a church almost on every street corner. I never went into any of them. Didn't really occur to me. I mean, I went to some of the big ones like John the Divine just because it's a beautiful space. When I went to Lemon, I knew I'd be living down the street from my grandparents' church, a little Presbyterian church there. So I kind of went there out of nostalgia, because I remember went to Sunday school there, that kind of thing. But gradually, it sort of hit me that I needed this too, that it was going to be mine. And then the big discovery, of course, was the Benedictine monastery about 90 miles north, that met the neighbors, and that they were remarkably hospitable. They had guest rooms where I could stay and write, go to church with them or not. They didn't care about that. They had a library, and when they learned I would return books, they actually loaned me books. It was a whole area of literature, early monastic literature, some of the best storytelling in the world. It's just all the stuff I was never aware of. So it started very gradually, and then like one of the pastors I met in Lemon said, you know, Lemon's so small that the pastors and the poets have to hang out together, and, which was true. And these people were all very well educated from places like Princeton, Cambridge, England, Claremont, California. And so they had fantastic libraries. So that was another thing. And they would borrow poetry from me, and I'd borrow theology from them. And it was a very nice little exchange there for years. And then gradually I began to see that I was actually, even though I was sitting out in western South Dakota, I was part of the zeitgeist somehow. That other people were just starting to discover monasteries, Protestants discovering that they would be welcome at monasteries, that kind of thing was sort of going on. I wasn't aware of it, except it was just something that I was doing out here because it made me happy. I mean, it was just pretty much that simple. I didn't really know what an abbey was when I first went out there. I wasn't seeking some kind of spiritual thing. I was going because Carol Bly, a wonderful writer from Minnesota, was doing a 3-day program out there, and I thought, I can't miss an opportunity to hear Carol Bly. It's at this place called Assumption Abbey. And those guys are still my friends, my homeboys.
I'll boldly share an anecdote. I had a girlfriend during a divorce that was sort of a retreat junkie.
A what junkie?
A retreat junkie.
Oh yes, I've met them.
Even when she felt that, you know, whether it was a Buddhist monastery in California, Big Sur, or whether it was Our Lady of Guadalupe in McMinnville, Oregon, you know, she had to spend this time.
She's Trappist. That's serious retreat junkie. Yeah.
She was the daughter of the curator of the Korea National Museum, who had lost his art collection when the Koreans had come in. Anyway, we went there, and I got the impression, as you did, that the Benedictines are all monastics, welcome but do not necessarily recruit.
Oh yeah.
Except this one time.
Yeah, well, I have two, in all the years, 30 years now, I've known Benedictine monks, and it's like hundreds of them. An old fogey and a young fogey have ever even said anything like, well, you should become a Catholic. They just don't. That's not their thing, because that's not being hospitable. That's trying to turn you into them, which in case of celibate Roman Catholic men would be kind of hard anyway. So, but they really, that's one of the reasons that their hospitality is so great, because they're not trying to make you like them. That's enough.
I really want to thank you. I read this book 10 years ago. I was living in the Redwood Forests, Northern California.
I've got a monastery there too.
That in 10 years I would be
and I wrote a little bit about that, you know, in the book, because I go back and forth in the winter time, and if I want to see the big sky, I have to go out on the ocean. Because Honolulu is a city, and we have light pollution and all that. I mean, I can see a lot of sky, and we have some mountains there, but if I want to see the big sky here, I have to go out on the sea. And you can see the weather coming. I mean, there's all kinds of similarities. Yeah, two things here. Yeah.
Oh, are you still in connection with Benedictine?
Yeah, I'm still an outlet at Assumption Abbey, but I don't get there very often. But we keep in touch. That's another, we keep in touch by Facebook and email. And letters.
Benedictine's in Hawaii?
Yeah, but it's a very remote area. It's hard for me to get to, and they're super conservative. Benedictines aren't really centralized, so they're very decentralized. They're conservative in a way that life is just too short. I don't want to go there. So, I mean, I've met a couple of them, and they're nice, but no, if I want to go to a monastery, I pretty much come. Well, I can go to New Zealand and Australia, but I can come to the mainland somewhere. But I'm still in close touch with the monks at St. John's in Minnesota and also in North Dakota.
My question for you, traveling around North Dakota, you've removed the oil influence in your analysis. What particular thing leaps out at you, change from then to now in small towns that you hear? Small towns?
Well, some of what I've been hearing here, that people are trying to figure out ways to move back. That there was more of that even in the East River of Dakota. And Fargo, like you know, cities all over the world are growing larger. I mean, Mexico City now has something like 20 million people, which I just can't get around. It's too many. So Fargo is growing. I didn't get to Bismarck on this trip because I'm coming back for a special event there in the fall. But Fargo is growing. The downtown is thriving, which was really good to see. But not so much. I mean, you know, except for the oil country, the people, the towns looked and felt the same in the landscape. That's what really surprised me about the oil area, how once you got a little south of Williston, most of that land was wide open, and there were some working oil wells, like a little patch of somebody's field, but everything else looked pretty much like it did 20 years ago, except it was greener. It was really nice. They got some pretty good rains up there, too. Let's see, a couple more maybe, and then we can... Well, okay, you two, and then you've got this guy.
I'm from London, and I left there quite a long time ago. And in your book, it not only validated and clarified a lot of thought that I had as well. I have two questions for you. First of all, how, after 20 years, how did you stay focused and centralized on what you wanted to write? And in the writing and in talking about the people, were you also looking for yourself?
I wasn't looking for myself, but I think I learned things about myself. And like one of the things, it really was as a writer, but also a person. When I was writing about some of the really nasty things that people were doing, you have a choice. You can write a hatchet job. You know, you can just really rant and rave. And when I would find myself starting to do that, I said, no, that's not what this book is. I don't want to do that. And then one day I remember very clearly, I was sitting there thinking, you know, all I have to do is write down what they said and what they did. And let people decide if it's that bad. And it really is. So that took the pressure off me, and then I could kind of let it go too. About years later, interesting, this woman who was one of the problems, not the biggest problem, but she gave these pastors a hard time. She actually discovered, with another pastor who came up there, that she was pretty gifted as a lay pastor. And it was wonderful. She really is. She's a former teacher. Her sermons are way more organized than any of mine. And really good. But she made a comment, and I felt like total gratification. She said, well, I guess we used to raise pastors and send them to school from here, and they'd come back. But I guess when they see how we treat pastors out here, it's harder to do these days. God, Almighty God. I didn't have to say anything. I wrote the book. I'm sure she read it. She never tell me she read it, but she did. But there it is, you know, that kind of thing. So I didn't write it with that in mind, but I think as I was writing it, I learned a lot of things. And then what I wanted to write, I just kept going. I went back over old notebooks from the days when we first came out here, stories I'd forgotten. I just wanted to get as much in there as I could to paint a complete picture of the place. And so what's your family name? I got to know if you're from Lemon.
Mead.
Mead.
M-E-A-D-E. Actually, Morristown, our rancher's name was.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. Okay.
But did you find yourself? Did you find yourself?
I'm always looking, I never know. And it changes, you know. I mean, I've been through, I know I'm really sick of death and dying because my dad died in 2002 of a blood disease at 85. My husband died at 57 the next year. My mom, God bless her, just kept going. She died at 92 in 2009. And my sister that I wrote about in the Cloister Walk, with brain damage, I spent a lot of time with her in the last couple of years of her life. She died last April. And I can do emergency rooms, I can do ICUs, I can do all that stuff, and I'm really sick of it. And I just, but that changes you in ways you don't know yet, especially the most recent death. I mean, I don't have to go to so many bad movies, because I used to take her to movies once a week. And I'm not going to as many bad movies anymore, but I know there are deeper things going on that I will learn eventually. But I think that's one of those things, if you think you know yourself, you probably don't. And that's one of those things you're always going to have to learn. But writing is actually a way, it is a way to discover what really does interest you, I guess. And reading too. Reading is another way. I'm actually reading Phil Jackson's 11 Rings right now. I'm really enjoying it, to my surprise. Yeah. I don't know anything about basketball, but actually that's a book about leadership, and it's really interesting. Linda Hazelton.
Well, I just wanted to call your attention to her, but what you just said reminded me that you once said that there was a monk in North Dakota who said, I don't know what I think until I see what I write.
Yeah. And that sounds like something David would say too. Well, even when he was a little boy, that how can you know? And this would be true of any writer. Like when I was in school in Honolulu, at the prep school, we had to do these term papers and serious research. We had to hand in index cards with our research, that was fine. But we had to hand in an outline of the paper. And that just stymied me. How can I write an outline before I've written the whole paper? And so what I would do is get the paper done early and then write the outline. That was the only way. And I think a lot of writers here could relate to that. How can I know what I'm going to say? I've done the research, I've got some ideas, but I don't know. I can't structure it from the outside. It has to come from the inside. So that's kind of how a lot of books and things get written. And that's, I think, why you do learn about yourself, because you're moving along. The process is teaching you. But thanks for reminding me of that. I forget what crazy monk said that. Probably Terrence. That he's still writing scholarship instead. And the best obituaries in the world, the Assumption Abbey newsletter. Oh my God, they're great. Two here, and then I think maybe we'll go to our book signing.
I'd like to go back to the psychology of the pastors being chewed up by their congregations. And I'm wondering if that's a frame of reference that's more widespread in South Dakota than we recognize. And it's sort of presented paradoxically in our politics. In that South Dakota has become an extremely politically conservative state. And the concern is that we need to cut back on the government, we need to cut spending, we need to reduce the debt. Yet when any effort is made in this state to reduce government spending in the state, such as Ellsworth Air Force Base or the hospital in Union, the Fifth Hatch Rig, which is going on right now, there's this tremendous uproar. And then in the Argus Leader recently, it was stated that South Dakota is per capita number 3 in terms of the amount of money that is brought in from the federal government. And 4 out of every $10 spent in the states from the federal government. And so it seems like we're in an incredible state of denial or repression or cognitive dissonance about how much we hate government, but how much government's such an integral part of our lives.
Okay, that's kind of 2 parts. And actually, there's a group called the Alvin Institute in Washington, D.C. that actually has conducted a lot of good research. And pastors turn to them when they're having problems with congregations, because that is just a human problem. And I think we feel it out here so starkly because a lot of these pastors are isolated in towns like Faith and Isabella and, And so they feel it a lot harder, and to get together with other pastors to understand that it's not them, it's a process that some congregations go through. But it does add to the instability here, because I remember looking, I got alerted to this by some of the pastors in Lemon, that you look at the history of some of these churches in the small towns and the country churches, they're changing pastors every 3 years. That's instability, and it's sort of built in. That's how they know how to take a pastor in, chew him up, spit him out in 3 years, and bring another one. I mean, and sometimes it's good, sometimes leave under good terms, sometimes not. But that kind of instability adds up after a while, and I think it does contribute to loss. As for the politics, I don't think the state's unusual in that you're taking a lot of very conservative states. I think there is a sense of denial because they're taking in a lot more money from the federal government than they're paying in any kind of Social Security tax or anything else. And if the federal government actually was reduced or something, places like this would suffer just terribly. It reminds me of something a friend of mine, a writer named Andrea Dworkin, once said, "Objectivity is what hasn't happened to you." And I think when it comes to politics, oh, we're cutting back government spending. Well, that's a big abstract idea that sounds really great until it gets down to, well, then we'll cut the fish hatchery, we'll cut Ellsworth, we'll cut this, we'll cut that. And then you start, well, that's me and my family. No, we can't do that. Let it happen someplace else. And I think, again, it's just a human phenomenon, but we're seeing some pretty spectacular examples of that kind of denial and thinking. But I remember, I helped judge a speech contest once at Lemon High School, and there was this young guy, actually a really nice family. I knew his dad, ranchers from south of Lemon, and he was given this talk about how we need to be free out here, and we've always been free, and we're all independent, was the word he kept using. And I'm thinking, this is such a dependent state. We're so dependent on the federal government, you know, for all of these, our money. That's where our money comes from. That is not, we're not independent, never have been, in terms of that sort of thing. And I remember just thinking, well, he's misguided, but I'm not the person who's going to set him right, you know, and all that. But again, it was that kind of thinking that you see. And I guess we have
I was just going to say, I meant David, without Abbey.
Oh.
A really nice place, although they moved there.
Yeah, that's another small town that is gone. Blue Cloud Abbey doesn't exist anymore. I've met a couple of the monks are down in Nebraska, and two of them went there. One of them went to St. John's in Minnesota. Brother Bennett, who's a very good writer, went up to Richardson. So they got two good writers up there now, Terrence and Brother B. But yeah, it's sad. I mean, they just couldn't keep it going. But yeah, Dave and I spent one Thanksgiving there, and it was just lovely. So you went there a lot? Or just, yeah. Okay, well, I think maybe I'll get a chair and a table, and we will have a book signing. The Humanities Council somehow convinced my publisher to bring out a new edition, a new cover of the book with the state seals and some other stuff just for this event. So spend more money.